Ever since Dana White was installed as UFC president by the Fertitta brothers following their purchase of the UFC in 2001, the Connecticut-born businessman has shown that he is no stranger to a war of words. That makes him beloved by fans, but like many promoters, White is often seen as something of a divisive figure behind the scenes. So let's check out the 8 UFC fighters that went to war with Dana White. Before we start with the countdown, please don't forget to subscribe to Extreme Jaws and press the bell icon to watch our videos first. Number 8. Tim Sylvia. Standing over 2 meters tall and having to cut weight to make a 265-pound heavyweight limit, Tim Sylvia was one of the original behemoths of the UFC heavyweight division during the early years of the Zuffa era. Despite his lumbering size, the Maniac possessed a fantastic jab and good defensive grappling skills that allowed him to become one of the standout fighters among the giants at 265 pounds. Sylvia would even reach the top of the mixed martial arts mountain twice, defeating Rico and Andrade to twice win the UFC heavyweight championship. Despite his success inside the cage, Sylvia failed to endear himself to the UFC president, and after losing to Minotauro with the interim title on the line, Sylvia would be granted his release from the UFC. Number 7. Anderson Silva. The case of Anderson Silva shows that even arguably the most successful fighter in the history of the UFC hasn't managed to evade the scorn of Dana White. Pair of uncharacteristically uneventful middleweight title defenses against fellow countrymen Pales Laitis and Damian Maia soured the relationship between White and one of his biggest stars. The latter of the two bouts saw Silva seemingly uninterested in engaging his clearly overmatched, and he instead spent much of his fight simply avoiding all action. A furious White left the arena prior to the conclusion of the bout and later stated in an interview with Ariel Helwani that the fight had marked the lowest point of his time in charge of the UFC. Silva would go on to refine his violent form at 185 pounds, and it appeared the spat between the pair had died down. That is until tempers flared again in 2017 when Silva was offered a fight with Yoel Romero at UFC 212 after his original opponent Kelvin Gastelum was unable to compete. Number 6. Jon Jones. Possibly the greatest talent that has ever entered the octagon. At first glance, Jon Jones seems like a promoter's dream. Marketable, unafraid to speak his mind, and with the habit of having incredible fights, Jones seems like the ideal fighter to build a promotion around. Unfortunately for Dana White, Jones is just as skilled at making headlines for his antics outside the cage as he is for his exploits inside the octagon. Ever since winning the UFC light heavyweight championship for the first time back in 2011, Jones has had a habit of getting his name in the press for all wrong reasons and bringing the UFC into disrepute as a result. Number 5. Ben Askren. Though his MMA career may have ended unceremoniously, the mere fact that Ben Askren ever competed in the UFC octagon was shocking considering his history with Dana White. Askren made his transition to cage fighting after a decorated career in amateur wrestling that saw him twice become NCAA Division I wrestling champion and represent the US in the 2008 Olympics. Askren would continue his success in the cage, becoming the Bellator welterweight champion in just his 7th professional fight. Askren would go from strength to strength in his time in Bellator, continuing to defend his title and picking up wins over Douglas Lima and Andre. Number 4. Frank Shamrock. One of the few fights in this list that has a genuine likelihood of never being solved, Dana White and Frank Shamrock have been butting heads since the early days of the sport. Shamrock was one of the first complete mixed martial artists and consistently proved his talents in the octagon, becoming the inaugural UFC light heavyweight champion in 1997, before retiring feeling like he had nothing left to prove in his fight business. However, much like his brother Ken, Frank never managed to formulate a consistently stable relationship with the UFC president. In the years following Dana's installation as the public figurehead of the UFC, he has engaged in several spats with Shamrock both in the press and on social media. Number 3. Oscar De La Hoya. The case of Oscar proves that you don't need to be employed by the UFC or even be a MMA fighter to find yourself in a feud with Dana Dana White. So how, I hear you asking, does a boxer that retired in 2008 become one of Dana White's sworn enemies? Well, after his career in the ring came to an end, De La Hoya became one of the most prominent promoters on the sport of boxing as the CEO of Golden Boys Promotions. He would put himself on a collision course with Dana after he stated in 2018 that UFC did not treat their fighters well and announced that Golden Boy Promotions would be venturing into MMA, promoting a trilogy fight between Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell. Number 2. Tito Ortiz. The most famous of all fight versus promoter beefs, Tito Ortiz and Dana White's on again off again relationship as the best of enemies has been going on for over 2 decades now. It all started in the late 90s when White actually served as Ortiz's manager before he was ever involved in running the UFC. After Zuffa's purchase in the UFC in 2001, Ortiz became one of the organization's biggest stars, recording 5 consecutive defenses of the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship and continuing to be a premier pay-per-view draw even after he was dethroned. Despite his success inside the cage, Tito and Dana had a long-running feud. Unlike many fighters in his position, Ortiz was not afraid to speak his mind about his boss. Prior to the fight with Lyoto Machida in 2007, Ortiz arrived at the weigh-ins for UFC 84 wearing a t-shirt saying, "Dana is my bitch." Number 1. Randy Couture. Despite being one of the biggest stars in the history of the UFC, Captain America, Randy and Dana White have never had the most stable of relationships. Despite his unremarkable 1911 record, make no mistake, Randy Couture is one of the greatest fighters in the history of MMA. The first man to capture UFC titles in 2 separate weight classes, Couture was the quintessential wrestling boxer in the early years of the sport. After defending the UFC heavyweight title in 2007, he abruptly decided to leave the company, complaining that Chuck Liddell was paid more than him even though the Iceman had lost his previous 2 fights. Dana was furious with Couture's decision and refused to release him from his contract, and the dispute ended up in court, with Zuffa filing a lawsuit against Couture in Nevada. So these were the 8 UFC fighters that went to war with Dana White.